thing to say to start with is that that Guillermo Grenier and Keith Bolender have switched roles, and Keith is going first. That's correct, isn't it?
No.
No, I'm going first. Then we have Keith, and Guillermo comes last.
All right. I hate self-rule, you know.
The macro to the micro.
Sorry, we had a coup.
The historical to a specific.
Sorry.
That's no problem. Can I just remind everybody, I can be very authoritarian and mute people, but I'm not going to do that. So please mute your own microphones, other than the fact that the speaker will need to have the microphone on. Okay, everybody else, please mute. I'm looking at Miriam. Sorry, Miriam, it's just I can see you in front of me. Fantastic.
All right, off you go then, Sjamme.
Perfect. Let me first pull up my. There we go. Can you all see my presentation now?
Yep.
Perfect. Let me start. Yeah, perfect. Still see it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. So, nice. Brief introduction. My name is Sjamme van der Voort. I'm a PhD student of Tony's. I'm in the final stages of writing my thesis, which I hope to submit before November, because my son is having himself a little sister in that month. What I'm presenting here today is taken from an article based on my thesis that I'm writing for a special edition of the Danish history journal dealing with the concept of time. That is how time plays a role in different historical circumstances and how we can approach it as historians. And now, if there's one sentence that has repeated itself over the last couple of supervision sessions with Tony, it's the phrase, well, actually, this thesis is not so much about Cuba as it is about theory. And that's very much true. When I introduce myself, I first say that I do memory studies and only then that I study Cuba. But memory studies is a field of research that deals with perceptions of the past and the present, and Cuba is a marvelous case study that offers these possibilities to test theoretical and methodological approaches that come out of the field. In this thematic issue of the Danish journal, one of the main approaches to time that is used is developed by the German historian Reinhard Koselleck, who divides our experience of time into 3 layers. First, he addresses what he calls astronomical time, that is the movement of the planet around the sun, which gives us the notion of seasons, days, hours, and so forth. The next layer of time is that which is determined by the birth, growth, decay, and death of living beings, plants, and buildings even. And finally, there's the interesting one. It's the idea of historical time, which is the imagined relation between our horizon of experience on one side, that is all of that which we are certain happened in the past, and our horizon of expectation on the other, and that is all of that of which we are somewhat certain that we can expect from the future. Now, what happens if you draw a line between these 2 horizons? We get an image of a particular perception of time and history, a subjective perception of time and history. And this is what Danish historian Niels Kaiser Nielsen has called a historical trope. Now, these tropes can take on all sorts of forms, all depending on the guiding narrative. This one is perhaps interesting for people calling in from the US, because it's a map over history that was great in the past, is no longer great in the present. And now we have to make it great again. If we translate this to British English, it's a past where we had control, a present where we no longer have control, so now we must take back control. I don't think that I have to make more clear that these tropes are powerful. But the question is, where does this power come from? How do we go about analyzing it? And what does it mean for investigations of memory in the social realm? Now, to get really closer to the power that these tropes have, I have included a 3rd step in my theoretical framework, and that is that of the work of Swedish geographer and philosopher Gunnar Olsen, who had this to say about the power of maps. He notes that any map, material or imagined, consists of dots and lines. And if we transpose these thoughts onto the idea of historical tropes, we get a very operational model for approaching them. The dots refer to the knowledge about the past that has been presented to us as true, and the lines of power to the narrative that gives them a logical coherence. Because, as Walter Benjamin put it, to articulate the past does not mean to recognize the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. The question now is, where do these dots and lines come from? Now, to get closer to a map of time as it is conceptualized in Cuba, my first group of sources are the history books for the secondary school system, as well as the manuals for teachers that were institutionalized during the 1970s. And to sum up just really quickly, there are two features that you need to know about this material. And the first is that it's incredibly uniform. You have a representation of history outside of Cuba as a circular trope of capitalist misery that's repeatedly imposed itself on Cuba in violent ways through Spanish colonialism, US imperialism mainly. And in opposition to this trope, you have a Cuban history that has a repetition of calls for resistance against these attacks, starting with the resistance of indigenous Cubans, personalized by Hathaway, and all the way through the 19th century and to the insurrection of the 1950s that finally liberates Cuba from this vicious circle. And the second thing you need to know about this material is that it is explicitly used for political purposes. And this is not my interpretation, but it's stated explicitly in the documents themselves. Their goal is to instill a revolutionary personality in the students, along with an allegiance to the government. This plays a little bit into the argument that Tony was making yesterday about multiple uses of the term revolution. Here viewed not as a practical term, but as a notion that is supposed to cover Cuban nationality across time and space with a strong moral guideline. So there we have the dots, the archive of memory that there to seize hold of in a moment of danger. The next group of sources that I looked at are from such a moment of danger, and I looked at the way that historical knowledge was operationalized in the newspaper Granma during the Mariel crisis in the spring of 1980. During the crisis, the representation of history in Granma follows the pattern that I established before of a constant repetition of evil imperialism that messes with the Cuban people. But instead of having various heroes from Cuban history in opposition to it, the media coverage gives the lines through history a very specific name, and that is that of Giron. And the function of summarizing Cuba's entire history into the one signifier of Giron is twofold. First, it very much establishes this revolutionary trope of Cuban history. And secondly, it establishes that anyone who does not fit the frame of a person going to the streets to fight this so-called Giron en Mayo is not only framed in political opposition to the government, but explicitly as ahistorical and therefore non-Cuban and in some cases even non-human. So for my next step in a search for this driving force of power of these lines through history, I went to Miami in February 2018 to conduct interviews with people who had received their education with the material that I investigated and who had migrated to Miami between Mariel and the Balsero crisis of 94. My interviews were open-ended life story interviews where I allowed the interviewees to construct their own narrative about their own lives and of that of the society around them. And what I found there was a lot of different stories, but that they all had a series of common tropes. And first, most of my interviewees, they framed their story along a trope of decline with a moment of danger located at a point of personal crisis. And for most, this was centered around 1959, but for others, it was actually centered around Mariel in 1980, which they related as a moment in which they became aware of inconsistencies in the narrative that they had been relying on before. And the stories that they told me were stories of time travel, first of a frustrated wish to travel into the future where they could have control and a future that would be great, but which they could not achieve in Cuba. And secondly, they expressed a nostalgic wish to travel back to the past, a past that did not exist any longer, a Cuba that did not exist anymore. What was also common among all the interviewees was that they all had a different source of knowledge that drove their conceptions of time and history. And these sources could include their family and friends who told them stories about the past, It could include music that they had listened to in Cuba and that they listen to now in Miami. It could include architecture. One guy even relied on commodities that were available in the US, which he could not access in Cuba, specifically shoes. In Cuba, there were no nice shoes. In Miami, there were all these nice shoes. So for him, Miami was the future. The conclusions that I draw out of my research are, first and foremost, that the efforts that the Cuban state after '59 put into creating a meta-narrative that guided its revolutionary policies were institutionalized on a broad scale through the educational reforms in the '70s, and that other outlets of the Cuban state were used to mobilize these in times of crisis. And this, in turn, was a factor in driving many Cubans into migration, as it framed them as falling outside of this Cuban time zone, where they were ahistorical and non-Cuban. My second conclusion is that any investigation of memory in a social realm cannot be based on a single type of source. And this is important because the field of memory studies is made up of people who come to it from all types of different academic backgrounds. And most of them are interested in how memory shows up in their particular field. The musicologist will look at how memory plays in a particular type of music. A sociologist will look at memory in a particular social relation. A film scholar at memory in a particular film. But my argument is that we need to be able to identify as many dots on the map of memory in order to understand how the lines are forged that guide people's journey across it. So to address the title of my presentation, what drives the lines of power that make up maps of time and space is not history with abstract senses of truth, but stories and their narrative power. And with that, I hope I have generated some questions. How do I end there?
Many thanks indeed, Sjamme. No, nice and concise and to the point. Okay, we have 5 to 10 minutes for questions as a result of that, or comments, so fire away. Michael, you're the first, so off you go.
Hello. Very interesting. I might have missed a little bit at some point, but I'm wondering, I'm remembering a comment of Derrida about 2 types of future. One type is the expectable, with its regularities and which people kind of depend on to plan their own futures. But the other is, I think he called it the yet to come. It's the unexpected, but it puts you into a state of suspense. And it seemed to me that the effect of this period, which has persisted, was to suspend the possibility of an improving future, and precisely to put people into this state of suspense, which was Derrida's second category. So that's about the effect in Cuba, and I wonder what you think of that.
Sorry, you cut out for a moment. The effect of the special period, you said?
I guess that it's something that began to happen in the special period, yes. And that's how I experienced it.
Yeah. Well, my interviews were with people who left, most of them before the special period really started. So I don't have any thoughts on the reception narrative there. If I'm like thinking out loud, what these thoughts do to my framework is that the yet to come, the suspense, is taken out of the equation for my interviewees, because they could not see any other future than an expectable future of non-progress into what they like, a modernity that they want to reach. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I'm making any sense, but Derrida does that to you.
Yes, but I suppose I'm wondering if you can speculate on the counterpart within Cuba, but perhaps that's more difficult.
I would be hesitant to do that because I don't have any interviews from there that I can build on.
Okay, something to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jackie, over to you.
Did you say Jackie? Hello. Yeah, this time it's me and not Harris. So, just a question about Sjamme. Would you mentioned about people, they miss the shoes and they miss the music, or they might have mentioned other things. I just wondered if anyone was talking about the neighborhood relationships.
Very much so.
Yeah, and friendships and the kind of relatedness and I suppose more specifically a sense of humor.
I don't have anybody who talks specifically about humor, but like the close social relation plays a part in each of the interviews. We always started each interview with who are you, who's your dad, who's your mum, where'd you grow up. For some people who came from very revolutionary families, this played a big role in their perceiving Mariel as a moment of danger, because they've then found that the basis of their knowledge didn't fit with this new situation where where actos de repudio were happening in their neighborhoods and things like that. So yeah, that plays a very big role. The shoes are the most like funny, humoristic thing to point at.
Yeah, and I suppose related to that, did they say anything about television programs, or could they just get anything they wanted anyway? Just
no, not television, radio and music. The perceived not illegality, but bad social standing that followed American music. There was a woman, she was very much into disco, and she felt that this was not acceptable in her Cuba, and she wanted to go to Miami where this was acceptable. So radio, not television.
Interesting. Thank you.
Very much. One more, and then we'll move on to the next paper. That one question is from Gabriel.
Can you see me?
I can see you.
Yes, that was wonderful. Thank you. Really delightful to hear. My question for you is about the Mariel destabilizing narratives on both sides of the Straits. Have you thought at all about the Mariel particularly as an event that's particularly powerful in destabilizing, from on the one hand the revolutionary narrative that only the oligarchy left? The Mariel obviously is a very different type of immigration, and from the Cuban exile perspective, the idea that Cuba was this perfect place without social problems, without racial mixture, that the Mariel comes and disabuses also. So have you worked on at all about the specifics of that?
Yeah, there's one of my interviewees. He was a frightening character. His stated goal in life was to kill communists, and he came with Mariel himself. So not he didn't see Mariel as a destabilizing factor, but the economic, what he called economic migrants who came after him, because he was a real exile figure, but those who came after him for what he called non-political reasons to get a better life. They
don't count.
No, they were disgracing. It was worse than not counting. They were disgracing the history of Cuba and of the historic exile community. He was a character, but that.
Interesting.
Sjamme, can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
So at the beginning you were talking about the different types of time, and I guess my question is, what were the sort of generation or stage in life of the people that you interviewed? Not generation, stage in life, because I'm thinking of somebody like Pérez Firmat and many others actually, but Pérez Firmat is so clear about articulating this idea that I didn't really have a history before. Well, I had a brief history, but as a child. But there's a whole life stretching out of me in this new land.
Mm.
And whether that can of not having a continuous history, but having more history ahead of you than behind you. But maybe the people that you interviewed, obviously, because it was recent, are speaking from the present about a period of their life when they were adults and had an established life in Cuba.
The people that I interviewed went to school after the educational material was institutionalized in the 70s, okay. And left before Mariel. So my math is failing me right now, but they were somewhere between 50 and 80.
So they would have been very young adults at the time that they left.
Yes. And this maybe influences the search for a future, because another factor was that some of them got stuck in jobs they didn't like or could not achieve an education that they wanted to for various reasons. Some because they were not very good at that job, maybe, but others because they had sexual preferences that did not fit el hombre nuevo.
I think it's just an interesting dimension in terms of time as subjective time. One of the things about COVID is that we're all approaching COVID and the suspension of time from our own perspective of where we are in the stages of our lives. So just something to intervene there and make you think a little bit, that's all. But thank you, I really enjoyed your paper.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sjamme. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. You will notice, by the way, that the future was glimpsed then when I was overruled with another question. So, having said that was the last question. Right, let's move on now to the next one, which I think I've got it right, is Guillermo now, correct?
No, it's me, Keith.
Bugger. Okay, right. Off you go then, Keith.
Okay, 50-50 chance, yeah. Just let me get my slides up. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
I can't see me in the little screen at the bottom. Can everyone?
We can see you.
Okay, well then that's fine. Oh, there we are. There we are. Perfect. All righty. Well, thank you. Welcome to my talk on the media war against Cuba. It's based on my latest book, Manufacturing the Enemy, The Media War Against Cuba. I'm really glad to be here in Nottingham virtually, but I'm a little sad not to be there physically because my favorite pub is there, the Old Trip to Jerusalem. So I'll have to go visit it virtually. Anyway, my talk today examines through some specific examples how the mainstream media in the United States has created a false narrative against the Cuban Revolution based on decades of misinformation, propaganda, and journalistic biases. all in support of Washington's policy of regime change. The corporate media has shown a remarkably consistent bias when it covers Cuba. And it doesn't matter, really, whether it's the left-leaning New York Times or the right-wing Fox News. National perspectives are usually irrelevant when it comes to negative Cuba coverage. Or, as Warren Hinkle, a columnist for the San Francisco Examiner, said, it's a journalistic axiom that if it's anti-Cuba, it has to be true. Even when Cuba does something positive, the mainstream corporate media is there to offer critical opinions, often disguised as balanced reporting, but in fact simply reinforcing all the anti-revolutionary biases. The most recent example occurred when the Havana government demonstrated its commitment to internationalism by sending hundreds of Cuban doctors and medical staffs around the world to help other nations fight the COVID pandemic. Incredibly, but I guess not surprisingly, Cuba's efforts to assist others has been met with the same old misinformation corporate media has utilized against the revolution for the past 6 decades. Let's look at a couple examples. One of the worst reports came out in early March when an article in Bloomberg tried to conflate Cuba's decision to send medical teams out of country as incompatible with the nation's own economic difficulties. The article was headlined, quote, "Coronavirus could give Cuba's flying doctors new wings," end quote. Noted that while the doctors would make greater than average salaries outside of Cuba, much of the country is still experiencing shortages in food and medicine. The article carried no mention of the negative economic effects of the American blockade, nor the efforts of the Trump administration to increase the punishment against the Cuban people. Acknowledging the impact of American sanctions is simply not permitted in mainstream media reporting. To do so would lend credence to Cuban complaints and give balance as to why the country faces such economic difficulties. Another example came from a CNN story on March 26th. The headline questioned, quote, "Coronavirus hit countries are asking Cuba for medical help. Why is the U.S. opposed?" End quote. Well, duh. The U.S. is opposed because they are, by default, against anything positive that comes from Cuba. It's not brain surgery to figure that out. The U.S. has been doing it for 60 years. But apparently, the media can't bring itself to acknowledge that basic truth, or more likely, they agree that coverage should be aligned with America's policy of hostility against Cuba. So the wording of this headline implies that the American government has a legitimate reason to object to Cuba sending medical teams around the world. So the reader, who usually still believes in the government's foreign policies and doesn't know much about Cuba, already has assimilated that false description that there is legitimacy to objecting to Cuba's internationalism. This is before even one word of the article is read. This is how the media manipulates the message and sets the parameters for acceptable discussions. And you'll also notice, too, how the media always classifies the Cuban government as a regime, implying illegitimacy that, again, the reader assimilates. One last point on COVID coverage, and it's about what the media doesn't report, which is just as important in shaping public opinion as what it does. Cuba is developing a vaccine called Soberana 01. The news program Mesa Redonda scheduled a lengthy report on the vaccine just a couple weeks ago to be shown on Cuba Vision through YouTube. Now, just by coincidence, at least that's what YouTube wants us to believe, Google blocked Cuba Vision just as they were going to broadcast the program. YouTube reestablished the channel the next day, announcing that there was no problem. So COVID coverage is the latest, but certainly not the only example of corporate media manipulation against Cuba. So why? Why is corporate media in the United States, as well as others, been so unfair and unbalanced when it comes to covering Cuba? The most important reason is economic ideology. The media's primary function now more than ever is to operate as a for-profit business. And that means the basic tenet of journalistic integrity, fairness, is thrown to the wayside in order to appease shareholders' wealth and advertiser expectations, not what's in the best interest of readership. So the mainstream corporate media, now owned by a very small number of ultra-capitalists in the United States, are in complete compliance to the political and economic ruling classes and its foreign policy objectives. Media then becomes state-controlled through the conjunction of the financial aims of private ownership and the political goals of leadership. Under U.S. rules of proprietorship, the media's voluntary compliance to disseminate government propaganda becomes more effective than overt state-run news organizations. When mainstream media ownership finds itself under the control of the uber-rich reactionary corporate elements of society, you don't need government pressure to ensure compliance. It comes willingly. And it's been that way since the revolutionary triumph in 1959 and even before that. So at first, the corporate media was enamored with Fidel, seeing him as the leader to get rid of the dictator Batista, but who would still maintain the status quo. But when Fidel started instituting policies that he said he would, and that confronted American hegemony, the press turned viciously against him in conformity to state objectives of regime change. Here's an example from an editorial cartoon in the Charleston News and Courier on January 1st, 1960, just 1 year after the triumph of the revolution. The cartoon played on the supposed immaturity and temperament of the Latin man, focusing on Fidel as a spoiled child in the playpen, with the caption reading, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." It was apparent, even at that early stage, what slant the mainstream media would take to ensure the public would appreciate just how ungrateful and vindictive the Cubans were following the revolution. So now let's take a few examples of media coverage from the early days of the revolution to what's happening now. The first major corporate media manipulation that gained international attention came during the Bay of Pigs in 1961. Just a few months prior to the invasion, the New York Times practically ridiculed Cuba for its well-justified fear. Quote, "It is incredible to us that the Cubans can still believe we're about to invade their island," end quote, the Times declared, adding that, quote, "It is difficult for Americans to understand that others can honestly believe things about us that we know to be false," end quote. This editorial was written when the Times and many other major newspapers were well aware of the planning for the Bay of Pigs invasion. It has long been the function of the corporate press to denigrate Havana's legitimate worries and complaints and to portray American hostility as either of no concern or completely non-existent. That was just one of the first examples of how far the American press would go in reporting misleading information, all in support of anti-revolutionary propaganda. A campaign that took personal form when a little boy washed up on shore in Florida in the 1990s. We all remember Elian Gonzalez. He created an international sensation by surviving the dangerous crossing of the Florida Straits on a raft, an attempt to reach the United States that cost the life of his mother and all the others on that raft. The press created a series of misinformed narratives that merged into characteristic anti-Cuban bias, including a report that Elian wouldn't last 6 months if he returned to the horrors of Cuba, that his father Juan Miguel really didn't want to have his son back, and that his mother died in a desperate bid to gain freedom on America's shores. Let's now turn to the media coverage of American contractor Alan Gross, who was arrested in 2009 after bringing in high-tech illegal communication equipment known as BGAN, designed to set up untraceable satellite communication networks, equipment prohibited internationally unless under the control of the government. His actions generated a mini industry of misrepresentation in the corporate media. The overwhelming articles falsely claimed Gross was simply carrying in low-level communication equipment, similar to cell phones. And we all know we can bring in cell phones to Cuba, you just can't bring in BGANs. Consistently misrepresenting what he was doing in Cuba, the press constructed the issue as a helpless American only trying to bring, quote, "free speech to an oppressed people under the nose of a government that did not want that to happen," end quote, according to CBS News. The worst example of media bias against Cuba occurred when corporate media sold their souls literally in order to ensure a completely unjust court decision in the case of the Cuban Five, the intelligence agent sent to Florida to infiltrate violent anti-revolutionary Cuban-American organizations with a history of terrorism against their former homeland. The arrest and trial of the Five in 1998 was marred by the unending stream of misinformation from the media, guaranteeing the Five would have no chance of a fair trial, resulting in incredibly long sentences. This travesty of justice was made possible by a number of journalists on the Miami Herald who were paid thousands of dollars by the United States government to write negative stories against the five, thereby abrogating any semblance of journalistic integrity. So what's been happening lately? Well, in 2014, President Obama announced a movement towards normalizing relations with Cuba, an effort supported by then Cuban President Raul Castro. The media, the corporate media in the United States in general, was actually positive about the move, not for the benefits it would bring to the Cuban people, but that it might be the new strategy to finally accomplish regime change. Obama's motive was to offer Cuba a carrot instead of the stick, and that the influx of US tourism, capitalism, and culture would finally convince the locals to overthrow their own government. Since then, President Donald Trump has rolled back all of Obama's initiatives and returned to the hostility policies against Cuba. Surprisingly, much of the media has been upset with the return to hostility because they wanted Obama's new way to continue as the best chance to force regime change. Trump was jeopardizing that new strategy by returning to the old strategy. So to finish up, I want to touch base on the latest media attacks against Cuba, those coming from the newest form, the social media. Twitter has been weaponized against Cuba with an attempt in 2014 to establish a social network built on texts. Named Zunzunio, the hope was that it could be used to organize smart mobs to trigger a Cuban uprising. What few in Cuba realized was that Zunzunio was funded and operated by US aid, the State Department organization that has been for years trying to undermine Cuban society. And we all know Facebook is simply a bottomless pit of anti-Cuban misinformation. There are so many other cases of media bias: the missile crisis, Brothers to the Rescue, Shoot Down, the Special Period, the Sonic attacks. I just don't have time to cover them in this short period. They are covered in my book. So to finish, corporate media, like the ruling elite in the United States, will simply not forgive Cuba for establishing true independence. The war of words and ideas in the press will undoubtedly continue. Thank you very much for listening.
Many thanks, Keith. We have about 3 minutes for questions, so over to you. Who's first? Sjamme is first. Off you go. Sjamme?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Two things. First, on the notion of first, thank you. It's great work. On the notion of Alan Gross, I remember having a hamburger in Havana with a journalist, a correspondent from a big corporate news outlet, and he complained that he really wanted to report on the sophistication of the technology that Alan Gross was bringing in, but the Cuban officials did not want to, they didn't give him access to any sources. So a question there would be, have you interviewed journalists who covered Cuba from these big corporate news outlets? And another, more of a wandering thought. In Cuba, human rights abuses happen as they do in other countries. So how should journalists go about reporting these? And especially given the fact that they cannot rely on Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, which do not have access to Cuba. So, two questions.
Right. So are you talking about the human rights problems in Cuba from the Cuban journalist perspective?
No. How should a journalist? Say I'm a journalist and I want to go to Cuba and I want to write stories that I want to sell for money to news organizations. How does a good story look like?
This gets into a fairly lengthy discussion, depending who you're writing it for. If you're writing it for the corporate media, you conform to how corporate media expects articles to be written about Cuba. So human rights from a corporate media perspective is the basic, people are thrown in jail for just saying something negative about Fidel or for no reason. There's no context as to the possibility that the dissidents are accepting material or financial aid from the United States, and the Cuban government treats them accordingly. So it really depends what media you're writing for. The alternative media, the secondary media can put some context into it, but not much. But if you're writing for the corporate media, you have no chance whatsoever to write from a Cuban perspective or to put very little context in the Cuban side if you want to get published. And my background's journalism. I have direct experience with articles I've written about Cuba from a Cuban perspective, and they just have no chance whatsoever to be published. So the first question, I have interviewed many journalists, the corporate journalists in Cuba, Grama, the other publications, as well as freelance independent journalists. Now, regarding Alan Gross, I've spoken to a number of Cuban officials at the time that they were getting the word out. It was fairly easy to discover that what Gross was bringing in was vegans, and the whole concept of that technology being illegal for any country to accept it coming into their borders without complete control. It just never ever got mentioned in corporate media in the United States or in any of the other Western liberal countries. It was just simply the dialogue, the narrative that he was just bringing in cell phones. Well, how horrible is the Cuban government? All this poor American was doing was bringing in cell phones. So that information that he was bringing in, a heck of a lot more than cell phones, never reached the mainstream media.
Right.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take two more questions. Can I take them in one after the other, and then Keith, over to you for the answer. So can we start with Manuel Ramirez and then Arnold?
Yeah. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. I want to know whether you have, like, in this context of the pandemic, if you have delved into the question of how the research for a vaccine against the coronavirus has been also used as an arm against the communist bloc, because both the Russian vaccine, at least right here in Spain, both the Russian and the Cuban vaccine have no credit for the Spanish mass media. And I don't know whether you have also delved into the question, into that issue in the American corporate mass media.
Yeah, the Russian, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Keith, can I take Arnold's question and then you can answer both? Over to you, Arnold.
Okay. Keith, that was great. I'm happy to be with you once again. Can you hear me well?
Absolutely.
Okay. I was wondering if you, in all your work, you've ever considered the Canadian angle, especially under the Trudeau government, which, in my view, assists the U.S. media war against Cuba. Allow me to take just one example, because you've mentioned it, COVID-19. I don't know if you recall, but at the height of the COVID-19 outbreak, the Indigenous nations in Manitoba wrote a formal letter request to the Trudeau government to ask their assistance to have a medical brigade and anti-COVID medication be sent to Manitoba to help the Indigenous communities there. Now, after that letter was sent, we heard nothing about it. But it just so happened 2 or 3 days later, at a press conference, one of the journalists dared to ask Chrystia Freeland, the foreign minister at the time, what about this? Is it not true that they asked for this help? She did not respond to the question. Instead, she said, we have the greatest health system in the world, even though people were dying all over the place. I mean, I'm adding that. We have the greatest system in the world. We don't need help from anyone. But the point is, after that was repeated. But the real reason that the Canadian government refused that is to say to Trump, we go along with your narrative against the medical brigades all over the world. Now, none of the Canadian media did a simple a check to find out why is she refused. What is the Trump's position? And why would Canadian government refuse, thus, in my view, providing credibility to the media war against Cuba with regards to COVID-19?
Okay, over to you, Keith.
Yeah, I'll answer Arnold's first. Yeah, I have so many examples of Canadian media being as bad or even worse than the corporate media in the United States as how it's covered Cuba. In particular, I spent a lot of time in the book discussing when Fidel Castro passed. The Canadian media was as bad, if not worse. It was horrible. And you know, as you well know, Arnold, the rest may not. The Toronto Star is you know, supposedly a mid to left wing paper. The worst article I've ever read about the death of Fidel was in the Toronto Star by a columnist by the name of Rosie DiMano. It was just horrible. It was just absolutely disgusting. So there's all sorts of examples of how Canadian media follows in line with the traditional false anti-Cuban, anti-revolutionary biases. So absolutely, I agree with you. In COVID, there's been some, from what my research has shown, there's been some coverage about Cuba's attempts to control the virus, which they've done very well. But again, the media puts it in context that the Cuban government is so authoritarian and they force the people to do this and this and this. And that just leads me into the response to Manuel's question. In the corporate media, there's been a fair amount of coverage about the Russian vaccine, basically just diminishing it and not taking it seriously. Oh, it's too fast, it can't be effective, blah, blah, blah. The American and the Canadian corporate media has been absolutely silent about the Cuban vaccine. So you can't say they've been negative or positive because they just haven't said anything. But that is a method of how corporate media constructs the narratives. As much as not telling something is as important as what you read. So there's so many examples of, you know, so many articles during the Obama normalization process there would be an explosion of coverage about Cuba, not just political, cultural, music, whatever. American journalists were going down to Cuba. You would not find 1 in 1,000 stories from an American journalist in corporate media that would mention not one word about the Cuban embargo. Nothing about the American strategy of aggression, of regime change. So again, the reader sees, oh, Cuba's opening up, but they still have all these horrible problems, but there's no context. So media controls the message by what they don't say.
Can I stop you there, please, Keith? If that's so. Right.
There's time for discussion once we're
I'm
finished.
stopping the discussion. Alpha, I can see your hand up. Could you possibly type your question if you have a question or a comment so that Keith can read it? Okay. Thank you very much. Guillermo, your turn, and we'll give you the full whack. Don't worry.
All right, great. Boy, Keith, you're asking a lot of American media there, man. You're asking for information and you're asking for accuracy. Come on. All right, so let's do this here. Can you see my screen? No, you cannot see my screen.
Not yet, no.
Okay.
Slideshow? No, I have not yet.
Well, it says that you can see my screen.
So
It's
you
lying
can't
to me.
I just can't see you.
Oh, yeah?
Go back in.
Okay, let's go back out and let's go back in. Let's try that. Can you see that?
Nope.
No.
Can you have you pressed the share screen?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's the go-to button here.
Do you want me to play it for you?
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and play it for me?
Okay.
And
See it now.
Oh, you can see it now?
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Thank you.
All right.
Yep.
You can see it?
Yeah, I can see
All
it
right.
now. Perfect.
Okay, great. So the topic today here is going to be the results of a poll that actually came out 1.5 years ago, because the most recent Cuba poll, the one that I just finished, it has not been released, and since the FIU paid for it and it gets a lot of eyes when I release it, it has to be released with all the appropriate fanfare, and it's going to be released at the end of September. So These are data that shows the trend. I picked out variables that show the trend of the attitudes that have been shaped by the Trump narrative among Cuban Americans about Cuba policy, U.S. Cuba policy. But the most current numbers you're going to have to, I'll circulate to our ACE organizers, Tony and Par, to circulate to the group when it comes out. I'll keep you informed. There is, however, a continuation of a narrative that I measured a year and a half ago with the 2018 released in 2019 Cuba poll, because we did it right at the end of the year. And that is that there's a retrenchment of the right, and it's given air beneath the wings of the right. The Trump narrative is giving a lot of airspace for the right to fly in the Cuban American population now, and to give a great deal of renewed life to a narrative that was, during the Obama years, diminishing in importance. The Cuba poll, that's all this is up on the files, by the way. I'll go through this quickly, but you have access to what I'm presenting in your conference packet. The Cuba poll has 1,000 people that have that we interview regularly. I keep getting my screen interfered with here. And the margin of error is 3%. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. Either 3% above or 3% below what the number is what theoretically, if you interview every Cuban, the answer will be. The takeaways, and I'll do these and I'll tell you again at the end with some data backing it up, is that the community is divided. The Cuban American community is not monolithic. Cuba is not monolithic. This is a news break. Monolithic attitudes, if they ever existed, stopped in the 1970s when people were wanting to travel back to Cuba from Miami, according to Miami Herald articles. So the community remains divided on how to deal with Cuba. There is a strong isolationist wave since Trump took control of the steering wheel. But in general, people before 1995 have a harder attitude towards U.S. Cuba policy than folks after 1995. The closer you get to the present, the less socialization to the toxic American environment, number one, and number two, the more folks would like to have some access to the relatives and family and life that they had back in Cuba. So you have the folks coming before 95 is one group, comes after 95 is another group in terms of isolationist versus engagement policies. There has been a decline across the board on support for Obama's engagement policies that continue to the most current survey. But there are some that remain, and we should be aware of those so we can build around them. And the last brief takeaway here is that, guess what? Cubans are Republicans. They're the only Latino group that is overwhelmingly so. And now that support has been transferred over to the person of Donald Trump, and the Cubans have really drunk the Kool-Aid on Trump. The characteristics of the divisions on attitudes and isolation and engagement are predictable. That is, time of departure from Cuba, you'll make more money betting that somebody that's recently departed from Cuba, recently departed, I didn't mean it that way, from Cuba is more engagement prone. And you're going to win more money if you say that somebody that came in the 60s is against engagement. Immigrant generations, second and third generations, are more, quote, like Americans. Therefore, they are less adamant on isolation of Cuba. They wonder why that's happening. But nevertheless, they do live in Miami. They do live in a huge Cuban enclave, 1 million Cubans there. So they're influenced by the Cuban narrative. Political party, Republicans are strongly isolationist, and Democrats not so much. And age, the younger, the older, that's a division that's very natural and generational, overlaps with generations. Engagement versus isolation. I'm just going to show you one variable on economic relationships that we had from the last survey that shows there's a strong support for American businesses expanding or maintaining their current activities. 2 years ago, American businesses were growing in their presence in Cuba, as well as the maintenance of the agricultural relationships that have been in effect since 2000. So you have a support for that. And then here, just real quickly, a breakdown of how most variables break down in the survey. And you can get the full report at the Cuban Research Institute site at FIU. But here you see that, look at the blue, and you see how the blue is larger in the 1995 to 2018 cohort, and folks not born in Cuba. That is 60%, 55% support American businesses, as opposed to, you look at the other end, those folks coming before 1980, 55% say all American business in Cuba should be stopped, economic activity. The same thing with age. The older are green. They don't want to, they want to stop relationships. Blue, on the other end, the young folks, they want to increase or maintain the relationships. Now let's look quickly at other policies, diplomatic relations. Even on this poll, where the poll that I'm not going to, that you're going to see in 2 weeks, there is support for maintaining diplomatic relationships, even though there might be a strong retrenchment of other anti-engagement policies. There's a strong support among Cuban American population in general to maintain economic relationships. There's still support for unrestricted travel for all Americans. That has decreased in the next poll, but it is still a population that is interested. And you can see in the next slide here how the blue, again, 95 to present and not born in Cuba, are the ones that are most interested in allowing unrestricted travel, whereas it's a very different story with those before 1995, coming before 1995. So you see the divisions in the community. They're predictable. The patterns are there. They've been there. We've been doing this poll since 1991, and for the last since 1995, we see the same patterns. Remittances. That number of 40% is growing. The more people that come over, the more people send money back, because it's the new arrivals that you see there that are more likely to send. 95 to 2018, 72% send remittances to the island. So that number is going to keep increasing. Now, here's an interesting pattern, and I don't want to make too much of this, but when you do more modeling and more sophisticated statistical manipulation of the data that we have, if we put all of the engagement questions together and give them a value, and you correlate that with, or you would do an analysis with the folks, how long people lived on the island before they came over, you see this interesting pattern where you have people that have lived in the island for very few years. The younger you come from Cuba, the more pro-engagement you are. I came very young. I'm very pro-engagement, right? So that's an example. And the older you came from the island, the more pro-engagement you are. You want to, really stop the embargo and a variety of other things. The people in the middle, the middle-aged folks, the folks that came when they're in the Middle Ages, are the ones that kind of, say hold on kind of attitude towards the folks on the island. So that's kind of an interesting little pattern there. Now, politics, real quickly. Cubans, the literature is replete about how politically active they are. They become citizens as soon as they can, thanks to the slip and slide of the Cuban Adjustments Act, right into residency and citizenship. You can see here that citizens, of course, are everywhere. But we're still leaving some citizens on the table. The folks that are most likely to want to change U.S. laws to encourage engagement, 35% of them are still staying back. They're not becoming citizens, which means they cannot register to vote. So there's still a voting block there that could be activated in the future. Now, in terms of registration, Cubans are still Republican. 54%. You'll see the same number in a couple of weeks, Phil, at 53, 54%. And the growing number is the not Democrats. It's the no party affiliation, and there you can see how no party affiliation is gaining support by the people that have come since 1995, by the migrants that have come since 1995. But the bad news is that in the 2018 poll, which was right after the midterm elections, every single one of those voters voted like Republicans. So in most parts of the United States, no party affiliation folks behave mostly like Democrats, although there's a split. But in Miami, the Cuban no party affiliation vote is a Republican vote. Party registration, you can see Republicans, the older generation is practically, three quarters Republican. The younger folks are more likely to be either, most likely to be no party affiliation. Now, over time, you can see, this is just, I got it back to 1997, there's been a decrease in the Republican Party, but it's hanging in there. It's not going to go away. It's got a lot of legs. Now, you'll see some growth. The Democrats are not doing so well. They pretty much are hoping that the independents can be won over. Now, this is about the Cuban American population. Miami will always go Democrat, but in a statewide election, like in a presidential election where the states counts, 100,000 Cuban votes can push it over the edge for a Republican candidate easily. So when we ask Cubans what motivates you to vote for a specific candidate, Cuba comes in dead last. Canada's position towards Cuba comes in dead last repeatedly. Okay, this is not the first time we've asked that question. We asked it again this time in 2020. So you can see that Cubans are not one-issue voters, right? So when we're asking them about Cuba, they give me answers about Cuba, but there are a lot of other issues like the economy, healthcare, and if you look at it by party, the blue being Democrat, you can see the Democrats are more interested about healthcare. The Republicans are more interested, are more motivated by the economy and jobs. The Democrats are more motivated by gun control issues than the Republicans. So, Cubans are Cubans, but try treating them like voters for a while, and maybe you'll get get a pulse out of them somewhere. All right, the embargo. This is the home stretch here. Cubans do not think the embargo has worked. Cubans might be recalcitrant in their views, but they're not come mierda, right? They know that the...
Guillermo, you got 1 minute, is that okay?
Yes, I'm done. The embargo is not, thinks it does not work, but there's a 50%, the community is split on whether they should continue the embargo. So the community is not moving on the embargo issue. They're supporting the embargo very strongly. The folks not born in Cuba are the ones that might make a difference. And what's different now is that folks are changing their mind. When Obama, they supported they were against the embargo during Obama. Now they're changing their mind during Trump. Especially the folks that have come before 1980. Now, this is my last slide because it kind of shows you how support for the embargo goes with the narrative that comes out of Washington. During the Clinton years, you had a decrease in support for the embargo. It stayed that way during the Bush years. It stayed at the Clinton level of support for the embargo. During the Obama years, there was a downhill slalom on support for the embargo. And now during Trump, it's going back up, support for the embargo. So Cubans don't, the last takeaway here is that, yes, it's a community divided. The folks before 95 are different. The folks after 1995, there's a retrenchment of isolationist attitudes. Cubans vote Republican. But the bottom line for me, and I'm going to test this hypothesis as I move forward, is that rather than controlling U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba, Cuban Americans seem to support what comes out of Washington. The narrative that comes out of Washington is very tejido, is kind of woven into the narrative in Miami. The whole report is at the FIU website, and that's the story, Morning Glory.
Many thanks, Guillermo. Okay, we got a couple of minutes for questions, so fire away. Miriam, you're first.
Thank you. I have enjoyed immensely your presentation, Guillermo. My question is, I found very interesting your model. Did you hear me?
Yeah, I do. I hear you.
I find very interesting your modeling about age and the connection with Cuba, because yes, that age between 40, 45, 50, or late 30 to 45 are the migration of professionals, which are critical for connecting with Cuba. And is that model, is how strong is that model? How much you think that model can express for other countries even, or you think it's American thing?
I think that model, again, I put it up there because it is an impressive concordance of variables. And the fact that, like you said, the migration wave that constitutes a lot of the professionals are precisely in the ones that are then, when they get to the United States, are less engagement prone, less where they want to maintain fewer relations with Cuba. And my hypothesis right now is that that's precisely the Cuban economy plays a great role in the inability of a lot of the professionals to make themselves, to reach the goals that they've been educated to reach. So I think that once they get to the United States, it might be a United States phenomenon, there is this somewhat false, but nevertheless a real sense that now I can be something. I won't be frustrated by government regulations or crappy economy. I can become, and the hell with I'm cutting with Cuba. I'm now taking my bar examination here. I'm taking my nurse's exam here. I'm taking I'm going to become a physician's practitioner. This is my life, and now I can use my skills. So I kind of read it like you do, except I see it as a negative in the sense that when they get to the United States, they feel like they can now achieve things that in Cuba they were trained to achieve, but the economy simply does not allow them to get there. That's a hypothesis. I pulled that completely out of one of my favorite orifices. So there's no testing on this, right? But that, I think, is where I'm going to be asking. I'm going to be talking.
I just try to imagine. Anyway,
no, don't imagine.
Can I pass on to
my ear, man? I haven't.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Pass it on. Two questions from. I'll take them in a row. Jackie to start with, and then followed by Sjamme. Okay. Over to you, Jackie.
Hi again. It's to do with, and I don't know quite how I want to frame the question, but it's to do with the level of involvement of, when you talk about engagements, the popularity of Cuban artists in Miami and the responses of the Cuban. I don't know if you've even looked at this because it's kind of on the fringe of what you seem to have talked about, which was fascinating, very enlightening, so thank you for that. But people like, I know there's Carlucho, there's and then there's Andy Vasquez, and there's a lot of cultural activity in Miami, which comes from Cuba, and then you've got Otaola and whatever he says. So I don't know if you've ever looked at what the responses of Cubans are to that in that popular culture field, and I'm interested in that.
I do have a question about where you get your information about Cuba, right? And there, what media you use and social media, et cetera, what cultural activities you go to. But I mean, you can, there is no coherence in, it is not at all, let's see, how can I say, contrary in the Cuban psyche to be really bust Cuban government with the embargo, and let's go hang out with a Cuban artist that is on the beach this weekend. There's no contradiction there whatsoever. There's a strong, the folks that end up supporting U.S. policy, they're doing so as in a relationship with the state, right, with the U.S. state. So they know that there's going to be, it's a state-to-state thing, and we want no economic relationships, and we want diplomatic relationships. Thanks to Obama, I don't think that's a bell they can unring. But until then, they didn't want diplomatic relationships either. That until Obama said, "The hell with you, we're going to do it." But those are the same folks that, except for the earlier part of the 80s and 90s, I mean, you still had the bonbons of events. You had big events of folks that are considered to be part of the machine, as it were. Yeah, right. So that turned people out and the old guard out. Not many people in those groups. I mean, you have octogenarian manifestations in Miami like nowhere else. But so yeah, I think that there is a lot of support for Cuban artists in Miami, and they're on the radio, and I mean, we have a radio station that's very, very current on Cuban rap, and at the same time, there's among those very young people, there's a dichotomy among the young people. There's some that don't think at all about Cuba, but when you're asked to think about Cuba, they think like their parents about Cuba, because they don't think about Cuba at all. It's not in their radar screen. So they're young Americans, and then when you think about Cuba, you think about like how Abuelita talks about Cuba, and so they are soft hardliners in that sense. But they hang out. There's a very strong cultural scene that sees a mix between we love Cuban culture, but we also hate. We want to be hard on the U.S. policy on Cuba.
Sjamme, is yours a quick question?
Quick question, quick answer at this stage, I think.
I'll do my best.
Hey, Sjamme. Nice seeing you.
Because of my thesis, I'm a bit obsessed with spaces and places. So I don't know if you could really quickly tell us about the places where your informants come from, and if there's any diversity across the space of.
No, it's a random telephone. It's a random telephone survey. The only way we can use statistics on it. So it's 1,000 people. I mean, we can GPS them, and we're mapping them, but they're in the South Florida, Miami area. Most of them, I don't know exactly where, because they're mostly are cell phones that we're calling, but they're from the Miami area, and they have addresses in Miami. But that's all I know, and then I know them by their profile. That's the only way we can use statistics on them if it's a random survey.
Okay, many thanks indeed. Jean, I saw you with your hand up, but do you mind writing your question or comment to Guillermo? Because we're overrunning quite a bit now. Is that possible?
Okay, will do.
Thank you very much.
Guillermo.
Hey, Jean. Hey, Jean. Hola.
Many thanks to the three panelists, and thanks for all the questions and contributions. And we now move quickly on to the next and last one, which is over to Pal.
Okay, so panel 8, health, well-being, and COVID. Salud, Bienestar, y COVID. So I'm going to welcome Miriam. We know Miriam is here, but also Fatima Elfitouri. Fatima, are you here?
I am.
Excellent. Can you make yourself visible? That would be really nice.
Can you see me?
Not yet.
Not yet. So 2 papers, and then we're going to have a fairly informal roundtable. If you can stay to the end, we'd really appreciate it.
Can you see me now? Am I visible?
You're about to go visible. There you are. Fantastic. Okay. Great. So Fatima, you're going to go first. Are you managing your own PowerPoint?
I don't have a PowerPoint.
Don't have a PowerPoint. You're just going to speak. That's great. Go for it. So 10 minutes more or less, yeah?
Sure, yeah. So hi everyone, I'm Fatima. It's really nice to be back. And so I'm a PhD candidate and I'm working between multiple fields. So I'm in anthropology of science, science and technology studies, and philosophy of science, and yeah, lots of science. And so I conducted a laboratory ethnography at the Center of Molecular Immunology in a scientific pole in Western Havana. And my paper was very long and I knew I wasn't going to do it justice in 10 minutes. So instead I've decided to situate my project as it currently stands. And I hope to hear your opinions and thoughts because I'm kind of bang in the middle of this project. And then at the end, if there is time, I will try to kind of delve into the paper a little bit. So my concern and my interest has been in biotechnology, when it comes to biotechnology in Cuba has really been on immunotherapy and specifically on cancer immunotherapy. So immunotherapy are basically therapies that utilize the immune system for the management of cancer. And I've been interested in the way scientists work in the lab amidst the material scarcity that is very characteristic of life in Cuba. And I've focused on the ways in which cancer immunotherapy is conceptualized within broader scientific and socio-political discussions. And the argument that I'm attempting to build in my thesis really situates chronicity, which is the principal paradigm used to orient cancer immunotherapies within broader debates. So just a few words about chronicity, because it's central to my project. So the intention of the center is really to make cancer chronic. And this is in line with the general discourse. Cancer is defined as a set of chronic diseases. However, globally, cancer management has used an infectious disease model. So for example, a patient with cancer more often than not is bombarded with the most aggressive of treatments to eradicate cancer once and for all, as if it were a bacterial or a viral infection. But with the chronicity model, what SIM has been trying to do is create or construct a library of therapies that comprise antibodies and vaccines. And this is something quite distinctive about the way biotechnology functions in Cuba, is that each center has a particular speciality, if you will. And so with SIM, they just produce antibodies and vaccines. And if you take, I don't know, a different center, they have a different kind of set of technologies that they employ. And so one of the key features of these therapies that are produced is that they must be the level of toxicity must be very, very low. And the rationale behind the strategy is to personalize these therapies for patients for long-term use. And so the aim is to decelerate the growth of the tumor and ideally create an environment where the cancer can coexist in the body without being detrimental. So the idea of low toxicity, so a common metaphor that is always employed by scientists, is that they're trying to produce therapies that would do what insulin did for diabetes. And so I just want to share just this quick point about the relationship between the biotech industry and public health sector. And so there's different things written about this, but the way I've experienced it and the way I've kind of read about it is that I see the biotech industry as just an extension of the public health system. And we know that public health is very political in Cuba, but over the past few months, we've seen that public health really is a political endeavor and a political thing globally. So the chronicity model, which is instantiated in relation to cancer at SIM, and SIM, which is part of the biotech sector, which is in close relation, or is one really with the public health system, is one that, so one of the things that I kind of have tried or have seen in the midst of, or as I conducted my fieldwork, is that public health in Cuba, when it first emerged in the 60s, was, I mean, a very revolutionary thing. Instituting healthcare as a constitutional right was a radical act. And SIM, as well, as I kind of the months that I've spent at SIM found that one of the key and most ambitious of their objectives, in my opinion, was to really rethink this mind-body separation that has dominated the medical field since the 18th the 18th and 19th century, where the goal of medicine or the medical establishment has been to treat the body while eliminating the excessive subtleties introduced by the mind and, of course, the social context. And this also speaks to the psychosocial approach that the public health sector in Cuba has taken. So what the chronicity paradigm is centering is the production of therapies that can be used for the remainder of a patient's life, taking into account the quality of life and rethinking the relationship of mind and body, which I want to develop in this thesis and argue that it is in fact part of a broader humanist project that one can chart to maybe the first revolution, although I think that would be very ambitious and requires a separate project. So the paper I submitted really focused on the development of the infrastructure that laid the context for immunotherapy to manifest as a worthwhile endeavor, both economically, socially, and of course, biomedically. And in particular, I focus on the figure of Fidel, which, so Fidel has, I guess, carried this techno-scientific imaginary that helped the formation of SIM with the promise of an immunotherapeutic contract, which basically, at least the way I use it, is an extension of the promise made by the state to provide healthcare. And in this case, one of the ways in which they're providing healthcare is by investing in basic research and in development. So for my interlocutors, particularly the older generation, Fidel was forever present when speaking about the history of biotechnology in Cuba, not so among the younger generation. So I just kind of want to, I know I don't have much time, so I just want to give kind of a brief overview of kind of Fidel's engagement with biotech, and hopefully with that give a brief history of biotechnology in Cuba. And so from the 1960s, Fidel has had a keen interest in harnessing science for industrialization and development. And this is a common global trend with the rise of big science, which was an important tool for the recently independent states, particularly of the global south in the 20th century. And I mean, he was personally very interested in science, and I've had so many stories of people telling me that if it wasn't for law and politics, Fidel would have been a scientist. So anyway, in the 1970s, he'd taken a particular interest in interferon, which is a protein that cells use to communicate, and particularly cells of the immune system. So this protein was discovered in the late 50s, and in the 60s, it was baptized as an antiviral penicillin. But that quickly failed, and but interferon found a new life in the 1970s as a magic bullet for cancer. And again, like we see this obsession with quick fixes, which is really reminiscent of the infectious model, which is still prevalent, and we've seen it with COVID. It's just, finding something very fast, but of course, COVID is a whole different story. So the story goes with interferon and Fidel is that he became very enamored with the potential of interferon and the extraction technology. So he found the leading researchers in Cuba and sent two groups, one to Finland and another to the US to trade and bring back the technology. When these scientists came back, they were installed in this makeshift labs in villas in the outskirts of town, while the construction of the first center was underway. And that center was really his baby, the Center of Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, which ended up producing interferon gamma and interferon alpha 2b, which the latter was used in this pandemic. So CIGB, which is the Center of Genetic Engineering, opened its doors in '86, but prior to that in '81, a biological front, which is a forum that was established. It's an interdisciplinary forum that kind of tied it tied government authorities, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Science, other research centres, health institutions, and universities in a collaborative network of research and development. And this kind of setup is very emblematic of science in Cuba, and we can look at the closed cycle. So each centre in Cuba, again, it functions in a way where it functions within a closed cycle where you have basic research, you have production, development, and marketing all in one place.
You've got about 1 minute.
Okay, I'll wrap up. So SIM has had a different trajectory in that it was really the child of Agustin Laje, who was the first director, and he currently still runs around in the lab and does so much. He's one of the directors of Cuba Pharma, which is the latest iteration of the biological front. And with that, I'm going to end. Thank you.
That's fabulous, thank you. And that means that you've got 10 minutes or so of questions. So please, comment. Ruby, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi, can you see me or hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh yeah, thank you so much, that was amazing. I just happened to be reading a chapter in a book that you might be interested in called We Are Cuba. I was reading a chapter on biotech, and you did amazing, like covering it all in such a short amount of time. I wanted to ask your opinion about like in the kind of upcoming future, because the chapter was talking a bit about like how important that the biotech sector has been in order to develop drugs that are like accessible in Cuba, because to avoid the blockade and stuff like that, and that even during the special period there was lots of funding for it. I wanted to ask your opinion on like, what do you think in the face of, you know, tourism collapsing because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the tightening blockade under Trump, like what do you think will be the role of protecting and developing biotech in Cuba, you know, in like the near future? Thank you.
Thank you. So I have read Helen Yafi's chapter, yes. So as it currently stands, the biotech sector functions in that it generates most of its income. The major problem is not to do so much with money, although I could be wrong, but from my understanding, it's really to do with the import of certain reagents. That's the major struggle in the lab, is that they can't get reagents, they can't conduct their experiments. But what is happening in terms of the blockade is that they are beginning, I mean, they've had, I think, for a decade, and I think Miriam can speak more to that, is that they've had these joint ventures with many Chinese institutions. So what they've been doing is that they take their whole setup and they've transformed it over to China. They have multiple sites. I believe they have a couple in India and in Singapore, and that is generating income for them. And so I imagine this was the idea, that science has always, as medicine prior, has been a major platform of generating a huge amount of income for them. And so with tourism, I think they will rely more on the science.
Thank you, Fatima. Thank you, Ruby, for your question. Miriam, at last, you can ask your question.
Yes, Fatima, I know that you have experience in Great Britain in biotechnology or biological science. And I also know that you spent a long time working in the lab or in the institution of Cuban biotechnology. Can you comment about your experience in two different environments?
Yeah. So one thing that I guess I saw, and I'm going to write about this in my thesis, is the role of innovation both in everyday life and in the lab. And one thing you see with Cuban scientists is that they are forced to be so damn innovative. It's unbelievable. So in terms of the way research is set up, it's exactly the same. There is nothing in terms of the science. They are using the same equipments that we use across the world in kind of most laboratories. But the difference is that I think Cuban students, Cuban scientists that I've seen have an understanding of how science works and how technology works in a way that I've not experienced, or I've not had to face. For example, when a machine breaks down in a lab in London, what you do is you call a technician I'm a technician with just to figure it out. But in Cuba, you don't necessarily have that option. And so you have to learn how to fix it yourself, or find ways to find novel ways to get your experiment moving ahead. And so that was, I think, the major difference for me is kind of the level of knowledge people had, and like what experimentation meant or means in the lab in Cuba is completely different from my personal experience.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Fatima. Thank you, Miriam. And a question from Lawrence. We may have time for one more if it's a quick question and answer. Lawrence, are you there?
Hello, Lawrence.
Oh, there. Sorry. Same kind of issue. You know that because you work in these things in Britain, that there's a huge momentum and pressure for technical advance in this field. And there's the need to draw on expertise from all around the world, and to, it seems to me, looking at, the Wellcome Trust and all the rest of it, to put in huge amounts of resources in order to keep up. How do the Cubans manage that?
I think collaboration is one way that they do that. So because of the lack of resources, they do send many of their students and researchers abroad, and that speeds and helps with their work. But I think more crucially, and this is what I've realized in my time in Cuba, that it's not about resources, it's not about technology, it's more about the way you think about the human. And I think what the chronicity model does particularly is that it's not about producing drugs to fight cancer or to fight these diseases, but it's about taking a holistic view of the human being and thinking about their social context, their material well-being, and so I think the Cubans, at least the scientists that I've worked with, realize that. And so yes, they complain a lot about that they don't have the latest technology, but it's much more than that. And I just think that is a tiny fraction of the problem. And we've seen that with COVID, in that the most advanced nations have not been able to deal with these huge health issues. And you see a country like Cuba, you see countries like Senegal who've had a better handle on things. So I don't think it's about technology. I hope that answered the question.
Well, it's partly about technology, unfortunately. I mean,
it is, but it's not completely.
You compensate for it with these other things to some extent, but you run the risk of falling out of the game.
Okay, I think we can leave that debate because it's becoming a debate until perhaps towards the end of the session. Thank you, Lawrence, for your question. Thanks for answering it, Fatima. We have Alf and we have Umberto. I'm going to ask you if you can wait until the end of the whole session, because depending on how many people we have in the round table and how much we have to say, there should be a chunk of time that we can talk about generally the Cuban health system, well-being more generally. So I'm going to ask if you can do that. I'm very grateful to you, and we're going to move on to Miriam and her presentation. Right, so Miriam, I'm going to get this ready.
Thank you, Fatima.
Thank you, Fatima.
Thank you, Fatima.
Thank you.
Where is she?
That's it.
Okay, Miriam, whenever you're ready, and please ask me to move your slide.
Ready, please.
Next slide.
I don't see the slides.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It's been a long day. Right, I'm going to try it again. Yes?
Yeah.
Can you see bigger?
I can
the whole thing, like yes, please. Okay. Just to make the presentation in 10 minutes, I will go straight from Cuba navigating in the Caribbean to analyze and explore in the regional cooperation, the scientific collaboration. To number 6, please. Here, yes. Regional cooperation in Cuba, in the Caribbean, has a strong influence in what is called in the paradigm social justice South-to-South collaboration, which is mainly in health diplomacy. But this is not what I am going to talk. I am going to explore the scientific collaboration inside the 13 small island development states in the Caribbean region. And by this, we study the publication in the database of Scopus between 2000 and 2018. Here you have, in this graph, the 13 nations of the Caribbean that are members of the United Nations. And all of them has, if you see the black bar, the black bar represent the collaboration, the scientific collaboration inside the region. And as you see, the country with more collaborations and the total amount of the region is 65,414. Cuba has the maximal representation in this collaboration, being Europe and Latin America, which is green and orange, the biggest partner or the preferential partner of Cuba, while the rest of the island of the Caribbean is North America in blue and also Europe. The next one, please. Here we have the number of publications and the collaboration of scientific collaboration of the 13 seats in the Caribbean. And in the left panel, you have population of the island versus GDP in millions, and the distribution of the islands where the diameter of the circles are the number of publications. As you saw in the previous slides, Cuban collaboration, the number of collaboration is the biggest in the island, as the same thing happens with the publication. If you go around the 10 million inhabitants, which are Dominican Republic, Cuba and Haiti in the same vertical line, Cuba is by far the biggest of the islands that have more publication. In the same way, Trinidad and Tobago, which is over the correlation line, and Jamaica has the second and third representation of the total population. Cuba publication represents 63% of the whole publication of the region. However, we saw before that Cuba collaboration with the Caribbean is the smallest. However, the collaboration as a whole made the Caribbean collaboration, because of Cuba, very small, Latin American second, and between Latin American and the Caribbean is a quarter of the whole collaboration. And Europe in the second, the biggest partner, again, because of the influence of Cuba. The next, please. Here we have the network analysis of only the collaboration inside the Caribbean. 60,414 collaboration only have 3,400 collaboration inside the Caribbean region. In blue are the nodes of the network representing the 13 seats, small island development states, while the squares are other islands in the Caribbean who are territories of France, United States, or Great Britain. The most striking thing in the network, although it's the smaller amount of paper of collaborations, is the clusters of Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, and Barbados, and the second cluster with Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, which is a cluster. Both clusters represent something that we inherit from the past, the division of the Caribbean by their metropolis in English speakers and Spanish speakers. Regardless that maybe there are not a strong relation, or there are no relation between Cuba and Puerto Rico, the scientific collaboration exists. The same thing with Dominican Republic. Another important thing in this network analysis is there are 16 cliques in which Cuba belongs to 14 of them, with different association of the island. And what does it mean? That there is a very close relationship in those collaboration. In other words, although Cuba has a small collaboration with the Caribbean islands, the intensity of the collaboration between other countries is quite strong. What we also knew, or we studied in this study, the next one, please, is that cluster of Trinidad, Tobago, and Jamaica represent mainly the institution with more collaboration in the whole region, which is University of West Indies, with 11,497 collaboration. This is, in this case, is papers, articles, no collaboration. The collaboration is in the graphic on the right. And the second institution with more collaboration is more articles is University of Havana. We can see in the right panel in the graphic that the University of West Indies, with this amount of 11,497 articles of publication, has collaboration with 10 of 13 members of the Caribbean region of a small island developing state. And the number of publications, as you can see in the graphic, is mainly from the campus Mona, San Agustin, and the Cape Hill in Barbados. But it's also in other hospitals and other part of the Caribbean where those in the bottom, Antigua and Barbados, Bahama, Jamaica, Guyana, and the rest of the countries that belong also to the CARICOM Association. What we can see in these two clusters separated in the network analysis is that the bilateral collaboration between University of West Indies and University of Havana could be critical for the rest of the region to benefit the connection between two big clusters divided by the language. Next one, please.
Miriam, you have about 1 or 2 minutes left.
Next one, please. Quick. We have studied this one before.
Miriam, are you there?
Have we lost the internet?
Yeah, it's frozen the image.
Yeah, Miriam's frozen, but you can hear me, right? So it's not me, it's
right.
Miriam. Okay.
Nothing much we can do.
Not much we can do about that right now. What a shame, other than maybe just ask her if she's there. Possibly not. What a shame. Everything's worked up until now.
The first casualty.
It is the first casualty, exactly. How did that even happen? Right. Should we just take a group vote? Okay, there's a whole chat going on. We'll take a group vote that we're probably just going to have to continue because we've all got lives to live after the conference is over.
Miriam's paper will be on the slides. Will be on the files anyway, won't they?
They will. I feel terrible about cutting her off because she's waited right until the very end. But there we are. Right, so kind of weird to be getting to that stage now, but we are going to move on to the round table, which does pick up on some of the things that Fatima was talking about, and certainly that Miriam was starting to talk about, specifically the idea of integrated responses. So if I could just call upon some of the people that I know that are there. I can't see you all, so if you make yourselves visible. Emily, thank you. Anne and Luke. We've got Raj. We might have Rick. We might have Richard. We've got Rosie. Can you make yourself visible? We've got Izzy. We've got Lauren. Have I missed anybody?
Me.
Tony. If you could make yourselves visible. So we're going to do a very informal end of panels, right? We're going to just present to you in order to get some feedback. And also for us to clarify our own ideas. Anybody who's part of the group, can you make yourselves visible to get some ideas from all of you? Something that we have been brewing over the last few months as we have met informally, originally a Zoom over drinks, where we ended up talking about Cuba. And then we started to incorporate new people. Miriam, I'm so sorry, but can we come back to it? Because otherwise it's just...
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I don't know what happened.
Your computer froze or your internet froze for whatever reason.
Okay,
so,
I can summarize the main thing, or you can put the one picture, which I think is very important.
Okay, hold on.
The one that is the Havana, the University of Havana provost, Miriam Nicado, and the vice rector of University of West Indies. Down. Next. Next. That one, before that one. Yes. I will summarize that Cuba has already a model, and it linked with the presentation of Núñez yesterday, that there is in the national collaboration is intersectorial and is also from the top institution to polyclinic or puesto de revisión de vectores, because it's so difficult to the two languages at the same time. But what is important that in 2019 there is a collaboration and an institute has been created for the sustainable development between the University of West Indies. We have the strengths of connecting all the islands in scientific collaboration, and University of Havana, who has this new model of collaboration in which there is connection between different structures in the country and manage to distribute along the island the national collaborators with the main productive institution of the country. Sorry, I couldn't for rushing.
That's okay. Thank you, Miriam. I'm sure there'll be questions and there'll be more information as a result of this. Okay, so we are going to carry on then. So as we were, ladies and gentlemen, Emily, could you make yourself visible? Anybody else who's part of this group on well-being in England and Cuba during times of COVID? Could you make yourselves visible? And I will just get the PowerPoint up and running. Very, very quick PowerPoint, so it's going to be very, very informal. And we are going to have, we hope, more of a discussion than another presentation, because it's been a really intense, really very interesting, but very intense 2 days. So let's do that. Okay, so I'm going to spend no more than 3 or 4 minutes just outlining what the project is at the moment and where we are with it. So here we go. This is my own PowerPoint. No sound. Okay, so I've just made up a title. Apologies to other people in the group because I haven't checked this out with you, but you know, we're doing our best with digital communication to keep working as a team. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Excellent, thank you. So, building back better, something like that from COVID-19. It's a project that is going to be looking at England and Cuba, and picking up on some of the ideas that we've been looking at with Jorge Núñez, Aurora Fernandez. Miriam just mentioned it as well. The importance of integrated, picking up on a word that Fatima just used, holistic and integrated local development as a response to the social inequalities that are being made visible to us or beginning to exist because of COVID. Okay, so we are in the process of putting together a proposal for the UKRI Agile Research Response, and there are currently 11 members of the project. I'll introduce some of them who are with us today in a second, in England and in Cuba. I'll go into more detail in a second. And so many of the UK-based members are going to introduce their initial ideas or just any plans they've got, what they think they might bring. And the key word at this stage is multidisciplinary. So what we're looking at is to have a multidisciplinary project that looks at how we might respond better to COVID by coming from each of our disciplines, integrating our perspectives, integrating the perspectives of people on the ground, and doing it, looking at England and Cuba, not as an exact comparison, but looking at some of the commonalities and differences between the two, okay? So in Cuba, we're working with members of the Cuba Research Forum, Rodrigo Espina, who you heard talk about racism today, who's the research director from the Centro Marinello in Havana, and the director of the Center for Local Development in Bayamo, in Granma Province, Ahmed Leon Telles, who was in Britain in January and February and made some very, very good networks with people here in a variety of different areas. Our aim with the project is to collect data which will allow us to analyze and evaluate how effective local responses are and can be in the future in providing responses to the many inequalities made visible in both contexts by COVID-19. And we're not saying, of course, that there is a direct equivalence between both contexts. What we're saying is that COVID has made visible, almost literally in some ways, those who can cope with COVID and those who can't cope with COVID, whether that's economically, whether that's in terms of health, whether that's generational, gender, ethnicity, etc., etc. So rather than give you a list of some of those inequalities, we're going to ask the data to make that clear. And the aim, because all of these agile research projects need to have a very clear impact dimension, the aim is to create a toolkit through knowledge sharing and co-authoring with local communities that provides that multi-agency, multidisciplinary and integrated response to future iterations of the pandemic. Sorry guys, it's no surprise, it's not going away. Okay, so this is a theme that we're going to adapt, one of the UKRI research themes. Really the second point, research and communities, how they help support vulnerable people, families and groups. How to understand civil society, for example, we're going to have to adapt that for Cuba. The voluntary sector, many of these categories and concepts will have to be adapted for Cuba. And how the actions of communities have influenced community resilience. I don't like the word resilience, but that's the word that they're using. Okay. So inequalities in Cuba and England have pre-existed the pandemic and have now been exacerbated or transformed by the pandemic or made visible by the pandemic. Okay, so that's the general idea. Methods and approaches, we are doing everything we can and we'll continue to do that. It's a really nice team that have got lots of really excellent methods for doing this, to decenter and to ground methods and analysis. So the focus is very much on the local. We're not doing a national picture. In Cuba, this will be a barrio or 2 barrios, in England, a ward or 2 wards. This is going to be, not least because of the digital nature, the virtual nature, an opportunity for methodological innovation in Cuba and in England. So we're going to be using and modifying our own data gathering methods, as well as the diagnostic research methods developed within the Cuban system since 1959. People are talking these days about the pesquisa, the initial way of evaluating the spread of COVID in the population in Cuba. So that's a kind of a recent version of those diagnoses, those diagnostic methods that have existed since 1959 in the social sciences, the health sciences, etc., etc. So we'll be learning from that Cuban diagnostic method. We're going to be taking 4 locations as our areas of focus, and we invite you to ask us why. So obviously the capitals, London and Havana, not municipios, barrios within London and Havana, or wards within London, barrios within Havana. Leicester, we have some of the members of the team from Leicester present today, so they can also explain that focus on Leicester, and Bayamo in Granma province. And we'll be attempting, first of all, to map some of the inequalities, including social, economic, cultural, educational, encompassing many of the identity categories and social categories that we're talking about. And really crucially, and I'm going to end in a second, we'll be asking local communities to identify what their inequalities are, rather than either a centralized or top-down approach, which we see evidence of in Cuba, but also in England. And produce that toolkit to provide some solutions for future iterations. So I am going to close the PowerPoint now. Here are the members of the team. Most of them are present with us right now, I think. Obviously not the Cuban ones. And we are just at a very early stage. So I'm going to hand over to anybody to talk about what their discipline will be, what their approach will be, what their contribution will be. Who have we got? Don't be shy. Emily?
I don't mind starting, to be fair.
Thanks,
yeah, I don't mind that. I'm more interested in the ideas of how the ideology of whiteness impacts on the decision making, the policy framework that's become exacerbated during COVID. I'm a lecturer in education studies, and I specialise in race and ethnicity. But through my sort of research journey, I've come to see that the ideology of whiteness actually underpins the decision making in relation to policy developments, particularly within the UK. And I'm interested in underpinning those policy decisions with real life experiences from Black and ethnically minoritized people within the particular areas that we're going to be looking at, and drawing out those counter narratives. I think they become really powerful. And it goes back to what other people were sort of saying, and I think it was Fatima was talking, she touched on it slightly towards the end of her presentation, about innovation and different ways of working and seeing data in different sort of ways. And the whole idea I have is like that, yes, statistically, research is grounded in data, but people's life stories mean just as much as that data, and can be just as powerful when questioning the hidden and the subtle nature, and sometimes I'm going to say it actually, the insidious nature of racism within society that's become more acute, and we can actually physically see it with the rise of COVID and the related deaths within that. And we talk with and there's a slight bit around master narratives as well, and how that's portrayed, how the dominance within society is then portrayed as I would call as being a master narrative, and that becomes something that's taken as a given. So obviously what we've done within the UK is we've started talking about social class and inequalities within social class. That's why we can see people from Black and ethnic minoritized backgrounds getting more adversely affected by COVID. But what actually happens is it's the policies, let's say within the NHS, that allows doctors, highly qualified middle class doctors, to be more on frontline services with COVID patients, rather than doing the high-end research that's within there. It's those nuances that I really want to look at within this, and that's pretty much me, really.
Thank you, Rick. That's really fantastic. So you mentioned policies, and that's again something that we can just try and firm up as we work through how to do this project. We'll be looking at the structures, we'll be looking at policies, we'll be looking at experience, narratives, etc., etc. Data is a very blunt and often overused term to describe something that's much more complex. So thank you for that. Anybody else as part of the team? Umberto's got his hand up, but let me see if we can get some more people in the team to just talk a little bit about what their interest is.
Okay, can I say something a little bit about impacts? Yeah.
Lauren, please do. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, when you applying for funding, they want you to specify impacts and you know, pathways to impacts and so on. And the vocabulary around all of that is not exactly inspiring. But to me, what impact means is the potential to do something positive and something useful in the world beyond academia. And also about how researchers can make best efforts to make sure that happens. And in this particular project, we're operating in two very different contexts, and we want to make sort of direct impacts in two very different contexts. And I think that although we're not making any comparison, we're not making a comparative study, we do have to think about those differences and how that will shape what our impacts and the objectives of our impacts might be. And the first stage would be to identify the groups of people who we would want to benefit, stakeholders, which is another horrible word, audiences for what we produce. But the most important thing is the second idea is that is those groups within the sort of general framework of the research question, to identify their needs and their priorities, which is what you were saying earlier, Par, about not imposing things on communities, but allowing their needs and requirements and priorities to come to the fore. And it's those things that should actually shape the impacts. So rather than the impacts and all the indicators and measures, all that sort of stuff, but the impacts need to be shaped by the people who are going to, you know what I mean. Now, England and Cuba might have different needs and priorities, but they'll certainly have different pathways to that impact. So, for example, policy briefs, toolkits, making them useful and getting them in the right hands in the two different places. And also the method of disseminating results will be different in both. So I think that the project needs to put those activities very early on in the project so that drives the project rather than us deciding beforehand what they're going to be.
Lauren, could you just, thank you very much for that, it's really useful, but could you just say a little bit about what your understanding of Cuba is? Rick, if you could do the same about tell us a little bit about the work that you've done and what your background is, so people can see why this comparison and why these disciplines.
Well, I did my PhD at Nottingham and I looked at local government participation, structures and processes for engagement and so on. So I'm hoping that will be quite useful in the Cuban context, particularly around, identifying community members that can facilitate research, and also perhaps identifying how impacts can be made, the pathways to impacts in that environment. I should know more about my environment really in the UK, shouldn't I? But it's just so awful.
That's all right. You're living in it, so it's fine. You know it.
I'll tell you about me. My PhD is in black and ethnic minoritized educational experience in predominantly white areas. It's a sort of life story from mine, really, because I grew up in a predominantly white area, and at a very early age, I understood the idea of difference and finding your place within that sort of hierarchy. And it's gone on to me doing my PhD in that sort of sense. Obviously, I have an issue in race, and the the main idea from my thesis is the idea of a fulcrum of domination that people have to deal with on a daily basis, that schooling in particular becomes almost a proving ground for people to acknowledge the dynamics in the hierarchy within wider society. And people take this on board and it becomes part of a social construct, it becomes internalized. It uses Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, where people don't define themselves as just being, they define themselves by someone else. So in effect, we have the imposition of stereotypes that makes Black and ethnic minoritized people shape their understanding of the world through that. You've got a Eurocentric curriculum and how that impacts on people, and how in that place, the directness of racism
breaking up.
Of 70s and 80s, with particularly in the UK, how people operate and how they have achieved in spite of that sort of, that says me really.
That's fantastic, Rick. You don't know, but you froze in the middle and then you spoke very quickly. Just like we're all making excuses.
I was on a roll.
We heard most of it.
Okay, all right. I'll shut up now because I will go on.
But it's really, really interesting. So, you know, when we're talking to each other, we're picking up, okay, so those of us who know Cuba academically or research-wise, and those of us who live in Britain or live in England, so it's very interesting because the whole question of, you know, of judgment and of trust and of mistrust and of inclusion and exclusion around COVID has very much been racialized, and similar things, not the same, but similar things are happening in Cuba. So if you go back to the Black question, you know, modes of behavior, modes of conduct, which are seen as appropriate, inappropriate, and how this might be gendered, racialized, etc., etc. So there is common ground. There's a lot of common ground. Obviously, we have to be very careful about grounding in very different contexts. Do we have anybody else who wants to talk? Emily made herself visible, and then we could go to some questions and then come back to people who haven't said anything.
Can you see me? Can you see me?
Yep.
I don't think. Can you see me?
No. Yes.
Yes. There's too many people. I mean, you know, so it's very crowded. Yeah, no, I've been here all the time. Yeah, no, I'm kind of wondering what my role would be in this. I'm an economist, but I've also been working on research collaboration. So I've got quite a network of people within Cuba, but you've already identified somebody in Havana and somebody in Bayamo who could be your main partners. I'm doing a bit of work with people at Flaxo who've been looking at how Cuba coped with the hurricane in communities in Havana, in central Havana. And I imagine that the Flaxo and the Juan Marinello probably can work closely together anyway, so that they can form a network on that side anyway. So yeah, I'm an economist, and so I don't think that there's all that much I can offer to this except for number crunching in terms of skills. But you know, one thing that strikes me is that you've got seem to have a very good bunch of people in Leicester. But in terms of people who are working sort of on the ground in communities in London, I mean, obviously we've got Lauren who's been working in Hackney to some extent, but we'd have to recruit more people who've actually got research experience in London, because Lauren's work was on Cuba and not.
It's a very valid point. I'm not sure if we're going to get a mirror image. But maybe we don't need a mirror image. Maybe we do. I could think of maybe Kathy McElwain, who could look at the Latin American population in London and the effects. But I guess, you know, we could try for a mirror image. But if we were to go down the path to say that experience and research experience make us able to understand contexts in a broader way, I don't know. I know I'm ducking out of that one, but otherwise it would just become, you know, if we're going to go down that rigorous route, that we've got a counterpart for every single discipline.
No, I mean, because I did suggest that bringing in somebody from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, because of course they've been doing a lot of work on things. I did talk to Martin. He's in the Outer Hebrides, so he couldn't join us, but he's kind of interested.
The door in anybody, Emily, so the more the merrier.
Yeah, well, I mean, what he does is he does a history of health systems. And so he's particularly interested in the public health system in the UK and how it's evolved and its failings because of recent reorganisations. That's kind of what he's been talking about, how the public health system was kind of hollowed out by the reorganisation. So I think, I mean, even if he couldn't work on it, he certainly know people who are in the whole groups of teams who are looking at how COVID was handled in this country, which I think might be quite useful.
Yep, and Rosie's made a point, she's made it by chat. London voices are important, doesn't have to cover all disciplines, should be people who are part of the communities. So you Londoners, go out and find some people, either academics or the local contacts. That's your job, because that's what we're asking the Leicester people to do as well. That's fantastic. Lauren, Emily, Anne, Luke, you've got a question, but you probably also want to say something, don't you? And Umberto, we will come to you in a second.
Yes, sorry, I was just going to say a couple of words rather than a question. So just to introduce myself, my name is Anne Luke and I'm a lecturer in childhood studies from the University of Leeds. And I just wanted to sort of bring to the discussion a couple of examples kind of that I've come across. And you talked a little bit more about the pesquisa, the survey, the national survey to try to seek out COVID cases in Cuba. And I think there was a very interesting, there's been an interesting cohort being I think it's the 3rd and 4th year medical students who've been carrying out this survey. And I think reading about the role of these young people brings forth to me attitudinal differences and different social constructions between the two countries. One thing that I found in a letter to a journal from one of the medical schools in Cuba is the fact that these surveys were not just welcomed as something which was it was useful to have a national survey on COVID, or to have local surveys rather on COVID, but also that this was an important part of the integration of the trainee doctors into their communities. So the trainee doctors went back to their communities to carry out the surveys, and this is very much integrated with that whole kind of primary healthcare system. Whereas I think that that kind of again, it's what it makes me think of what Miriam said about this kind of intersectoral approaches and kind of integrated approaches that have been key, and the different view of what the role of kind of young people could be in terms of that inclusion, I suppose, in the process. And the other example I've got, which is one I talked to Rosie about when we spoke this morning, and what I think is quite interesting, and as someone who has spent several months trying to home educate my children while working, Cuba, a lot of people probably don't know, but most of the kind of early childhood education, 0 to 7 education in Cuba, I think about 80% of that doesn't happen in the nursery, it happens in the home. It has a home-based education system. It's almost made to measure for the COVID era. So it would be very interesting to see how the system, which is called Educa a tu Hijo, to see how that has adapted, or what impacts and how important that has been. I mean, the fact that this kind of integration into local communities of child sort of early childhood education, how important that's been. So those are just two sort of examples, if that's helpful.
That's fantastic, thank you, Anne. Before we go to questions, Rosie, I'm kind of aware that you might want to say something, although you have by chat, or Izzy, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Anything you'd like to say?
Rosie, do you want to go first, and then I'll go? All right, you go first. I'll go after. All right, mine will be short and sweet because I haven't done a big think. What I'm interested in looking at is, I think, how the creative industry, so how kind of the cultural side of things has been kept or hasn't been kept running. And I think I'm interested in that because cultural history is my background and it's the area I work in. But I see it as an area where artists are generally very reliant on their audiences and close contact with their intended audiences who are going to be the recipient of the work, and there's a lot of energy that's taken from it and channeled into other work. So then all of a sudden, when our lives are made smaller than normal and we're restricted at home, how conditions are created for them to keep creating to then feed into people's everyday lives. Because I think there's a very real danger of when we get bored that maybe people aren't as careful, like you might break lockdown, you might go out. And so I think that's what I'm interested in, how it's organized, how it's been facilitated and organized at various levels of institutions, and perhaps among artists themselves, and how they've kept themselves in a mindset to carry on creating.
Excellent, thank you, Izzy. No, that's fine. Izzy and I have talked as well, because I look at a different level of culture, which is cultural participation, so cultura comunitaria, grassroots participation. And one of the things that has broken my heart during COVID in the UK, but in Cuba too, to a lesser extent, I think, is that we have been given plenty of direction in terms of being economically productive. But we've been given very little opportunity, and that includes children, to socialise. And I can't think that it's impossible, regardless of the bloody weather in the UK, I can't think it's that impossible to create spaces for us to be social before we're economically productive. That's my rant. Okay, Rosie, did you want to say something?
Okay, yeah, I'll do my rant if you've done your rant. But so I'm Rosie, I'm a lecturer at DMU in education, but I've just finished a postdoc on local universities in Cuba. So that's what I was going to talk about. But I think Hans touched on stuff, we got stuff from Jorge and Aurora yesterday. So the thing that I'd like to kind of bring in is disability, because I think that's quite a significant one in the UK, and I'd be really interested to see what Cuba's doing. So if it works, I recorded my 3 minutes so that I wouldn't talk to everybody else. Let's try that one. Has it come up?
Yep, it's coming up.
Okay, so I'm just gonna play it rather than me talking forever. You can't hear it. Can you not hear it?
Nope.
No.
Okay, that didn't work then, did it? All right, I'll just talk it through like a normal person. Okay. Yeah. I'll bring up the old one. I'm really sorry. That was supposed to speed things up, and it did the side of it.
Take your time, Rosie. It's been a very long 2 days. Take your time.
So the only thing I put on the PowerPoint is that I pulled loads of stuff off the internet to use articles and things, so I put the links to those on the slides that
You can always share the thing with us after. And
yeah, absolutely. So it's really thinking about disability having been one of the areas that's been the clearest inequalities in the UK in particular, and the way that it kind of shows up the ways in which we already exclude disabled people from society, and the way that their citizenship ends up being kind of provisional. So a lot of people, disabled people at the beginning of the pandemic, were noting quite forcibly how the adjustments and changes that they had always needed in their lives and had been told were impossible, like online and like working from home, suddenly became possible when they were needed for non-disabled people. And that kind of, there's a bigger kind of fiction of inclusion that comes in now, where we see the rights of disabled people that seem to be absolute rights becoming provisional rights under a kind of a COVID situation. So we've seen do not resuscitate notices being put on people simply because of learning disabilities. We've seen emergency legislation that limits care. So instead of having to offer proper care, local authorities just have to meet human rights. In terms of COVID treatment, one of the categories that can prevent you from getting ICU is if you're a person who requires permanent personal care. Civil liberties, particularly around mental health, so the sectioning laws have been changed temporarily to require just one doctor, and it can be someone that you don't know. So all of that's happening on the big scale, but then the kind of community and locality link comes when we start looking at the easing of lockdown. So if we look at what's happening in the UK with indicators of well-being, so there's ONS work on that, and it shows all the indicators of well-being are improving in the non-disabled community, but they're not improving in the disabled community. Partly because those adjustments we had at the beginning are starting to be withdrawn, and partly because shielding is being withdrawn. So you're not getting your food packages, your statutory sick pay, and that's kind of being either privatised or brought into the community in voluntary sector to meet. So the government guidance and the NHS guidance tells you now you don't get this government support, but you might get it from NHS volunteers, from local community groups. So there's a thing about moving responsibility back onto the individual and the community, and also the way that disabled people rely on the choices that other people are making. So the ways that non-disabled people are interacting with, socializing with distancing and space, then limits what disabled people feel safe or able to do a lot of the time. So really, it's just about thinking, how are we conceiving of different groups as part of our community? And there seems to be a thing in the UK where we've decided that a non-disabled majority can get on with life and exclude a disabled minority. So that I'd be really interested to see what's happening in Cuba with all of that at the moment.
Excellent, thank you, Rosie. Just since you mentioned well-being and surveys on well-being, to make the point, I think, because it's quite an important point in the context of COVID in Cuba and in England, that well-being is normally understood and experienced by people in a relational way, in a dialogic way. It's not an absolute. And if COVID has done anything, it has made very, very apparent the possibility of division, social divisions and social differentiation, right? Whether that's economic, whether that means that you can afford to eat, or you can afford to work from home, or you have child-caring responsibilities that you can't pass on to anybody else. So that idea of well-being really, really badly compromised in England by the multiple effects of COVID, and in different ways also compromised in Cuba for many of the same reasons, possibly more to do with market and power to consume, food security, all those kinds of things, right? So there's a whole hinterland there of things that we could look at in terms of well-being. Is there anybody from the group who's not said anything, and then we can move on to questions? Anybody who'd like to say something?
Do you want me to say anything about Leicester, Pa?
Yes, please, Rich. Yes, that'd be fantastic. Do you want to just introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, sure. My name is Richard Hall, and I'm a professor of education. I work with Rick and I work with Raj at De Montfort in Leicester. And I guess Leicester's quite, if we think about mapping inequalities, Leicester's quite an interesting space, I think. It's classed as being a relatively diverse space with a range of kind of communities and languages spoken. It is a city with high levels of socioeconomic deprivation. It is a Labour city that sits in a sea of blue, so it sits in a miasma of conservatism. It is also the first city in the country to be a test case under COVID for a local lockdown. That revealed high levels of, I guess, of kind of exploitation within certain of the kind of industries, manufacturing industries in the city that were effectively providing things like kind of fast fashion, for instance. So there are all sorts of issues there, and who is being forced into work and how that is being monitored and mapped, but also how institutions are folding in on top of it. And that includes the university. So the university where Raj, Rick and I work would class itself, I guess. It's a teaching intensive and research active institution, but it works on, I guess, on kind of neighborhood and local kind of knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange, public good type activity. And we have a range of kind of activities that come out of our kind of, I guess it's kind of social impact department that we would want to work with, that want to look at mapping the response of an institution to the kind of pandemic, in particular because there's been an attrition on trust in institutions, on experts, on politicians, on whoever during the kind of pandemic. And for me, that's like, I guess that's really important because I've seen the response of a number of schools where I'm a governor or where my partner works, in terms of risk assessments and how they respond in terms of kind of, I guess, community support beyond the curriculum, forget the curriculum, in terms of effectively of trying to generate a recovery curriculum for both the community and for the individual students, but also then how that maps onto infrastructures in civil society like food banks, for instance. And we've seen a kind of an explosion in there. We already had loads in the city, but we've seen a kind of explosion of activity around those. So there's a way of trying to think about the relationship between the city deprivation, mapping that, and then the role of specific institutions in that space, and how that talks to policy and politics. And in that, I'm interested, I guess, in the Cuban angle, because I'm interested in what we might learn from that and what connections there might be, what patterns might emerge, what modes of understanding, theorizing, and then working maybe against kind of policy and for the community that might emerge, what dialogues are in that space. And I'll shut up now.
Thanks, Rich. And I think we're just going to pass over to Raj. Your name's been mentioned, Raj, so make yourself visible, make yourself seen. If you want to, or you could just talk, it's fine.
Yeah, hi. I'm Raj. As Richard said, work at DeMontfort University with Richard, Rick, and Rosie. I'm currently doing my PhD on looking at the experiences of women of colour in academia and focusing on how we should stop putting it into this BAME category and how different people experience, different minoritized groups experience racism or sexism different. And also interested in identity. I was interested in this project, looking at it, how the response was to the Leicester lockdown on the BAME communities, and how we saw like this blame game which happened in Leicester when it initially went into the lockdown. But however, what we did not see was the discussion of the underlying and structural inequalities which those communities were facing over the years. Like, for example, BAME communities more likely to be in jobs which were high risk COVID. We saw comments from MPs on BAME communities just not getting it, but yet offering them limited support. So it was quite interesting to see how in this kind of toxic environment, how we saw like a community resilience and a community agency in supporting each other. For example, local community centres, religious centres, they came together to kind of circulate information and support each other at a time where everyone else was too busy playing the blame game. So in reference to some of the comments that Rich has just said, it's just looking at community agency and looking at how they came together to kind of protect themselves from that toxic racial inequalities, and some of those discussions that were happening on social media, by whether it was providing information in different languages, providing food for each other, just information and things like that. So it was just really good to see kind of how they attempted to preserve their values by building on the social capital and the people they knew, because they no longer could trust the wider circles around.
Excellent, thanks, Raj. So trust is coming out as one of the major themes here in both contexts. So I think that's pretty much everybody, if I'm not wrong. I think we might have lost Umberto Labrada. I'm sorry, Umberto, if you've gone without getting your question answered, but you can always chat. But Michael Channon, your hand is up. And anybody else want to put up their hand? We can hand it over now to questions for us, but also obviously to Miriam. Oh, Umberto's still there.
Umberto's back.
Umberto's back. So let's start with Umberto and then Michael. And questions for Fatima, questions for Miriam. All of our computers, I think, are about to die because it's just been a very long haul for them as well. So let's do it as efficiently as possible. So, Umberto, over to you.
Thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's really a great pleasure to hear all of you. Yeah, it's excellent. Yeah, but I really want to have, I would say, 3 short comments. The first one is, well, I'm so happy in seeing how research about COVID will be put in place in Cuba and United Kingdom. For me, it's really amazing to see the result. It would be really amazing to see the result of this particular research. With regard of that, I have been living in United Kingdom. I have been living in Cuba. In Cuba, I was born there. I'm now working for Coventry University for 2 years. I spent 1 year. I have 1 year left. And yes, for me, it's very important in the particular case of Cuba, the way that this kind of research can express the voice of the people who are just there, because it's very important. This is my first comment. My second comment, because I have been now running more than 2 projects in Cuba about food security. It's a big issue. Food security, food uncertainty, because at the end of the day, nobody died for starvation. But the uncertainty about that is really huge, including my mother. She called me every day by saying, "What can I eat today?" And for me, the most important point that I really want to express to you is how it can be possible to involve in the research team the owner of the problem and the owner of the solution. It's a way that we can ensure that later this kind of knowledge can be put into the policy terms, into something concrete that can transform the Cuban society. So I really believe that in the way that the leader of the research can be the owner of the problem and the owner of the solution can be a very interesting step further. In my particular experience, was a very, I would say, positive thing. It's like it's a different research. It's more action research oriented than in trying to understand the reality. Understand the reality is very good, but you don't know when the reality is, in my view, until you try to change it. And I think the Cuban need that in my particular experience. And in this research is able to promote these little things in a particular municipality or neighborhood can be great.
Thank you. Does anybody want to respond to Umberto? I think, probably we have a lot to learn in England as well. I think that's the point. We have to learn from each other. And anybody want to answer that whole question about problem and solution?
Yeah, look at for me, I'm PhD graduated. Yeah, and I learned from the traditional school of doing research and so on. But really, I can induce some change when I change my mind. And my team was full of normal, ordinary farmers, policymakers, and all the people who are really living the process in Cuba or particularly in Cuba. So I challenging you to involve all these people because it's a way that you can ensure a little bit how all this knowledge can be put in practice.
Thank you, Umberto. Anybody want to respond to that? I'm looking at Rick, because Rick, we had a bit of a discussion about this the other day, didn't we? Can't hear you.
When it comes to solutions, I have some, I'm going to be perfectly honest, I have some issues, and anybody that knows me within the team will say I have very little hope in relation to putting into practice some of these solutions, because the problem doesn't lie with the oppressed. And if we're particularly looking at the idea of race, ethnicity or disability and how these things affect them, that COVID's made more acute, it's not their issue to say. It's movement from the dominant group within society that needs to take place. And I think we start that process by doing pieces of research like this and highlighting the ideologies that are in place that impact adversely on the oppressed groups within society. It is the best way for me to answer it, because the more that I've done my research, the more that I've lived my life, what's actually happened is I've come to the conclusion that this isn't necessarily something we can deal with as a community within ourselves. It has to be a movement from the dominant group within society to actually acknowledge the privilege that they have and want to shape that, rather than shape a system that legitimizes their privilege, which is what's happened particularly in the UK. And if you use a critical race theory analysis, you can look at interest convergence and contradictory closing as a way of sitting there and saying, well, we've done this because these people have developed. And the widening of the middle class, actually, if you want to use a class analysis, has been used to co-opt people into this idea of a particular mode of production. So I failed. I don't want to go down a road of sitting there saying, actually, these are our solutions that we want to take away. We're raising those questions, and that fits very much into the life stories. But it also challenges the notion of research as well, and that sort of post-Enlightenment period sort of moving away from sort of metaphysics into this sort of scientific basis that quantitative and qualitative research has to be sort of similar to the natural sciences and all things like that, and how we try to mirror those when actually people's real stories and their understanding of the way the world works is something that can be really powerful. If that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense, and you said it so much better than any of us could say it. So thank you, Rick. Thanks for that. So I'm going to move on just because people will want to be leaving. Michael, you had a question. Your hand's been up for a very long time.
Yes, thank you. It's a very interesting project. I've got initially a very simple question and then perhaps a response depending on the answer. Forgive me if I missed something, but what is the form of dissemination that you're hoping to achieve? This relates back, by the way, to Lauren's comments about impact.
So at this stage, I'll speak for myself. We're not there yet. I'm going to be completely honest. We're not there yet. I think, again, that's something that needs to be asked of the people who may end up having to create the structures, as Rick was saying, to make this happen, but also obviously ask to the people who might potentially benefit. We're not there yet, and I think that the answers will be quite different for Cuba and for England. That's the first thing to say. Does anybody want to add anything to my completely rubbish answer to Michael's question?
I would,
Go for it.
sorry, I just kind of launched in there, didn't I? Classic white man, I should say. I would say that one of Rick's points, I think, was about the kind of participative nature of this. So I think we would want, at the moment, we're sitting here as a set of academics, I think, trying to describe kind of or shape the parameters. I think that what we would want to do is to look at it's more community engagement and more participative engagement and more horizontal engagement and more kind of bottom-up engagement, certainly in terms of defining kind of, well, what is useful here and for what ends. So I guess there would be modes that would be traditional, but actually I would want to be in a deeper sense of kind of conversation about what is useful for people, what do they need to know, what is useful for them in enacting change in their lives, and through what forums do we engage with that, and actually how do we do it in a pandemic? Because one of the things we've been having to think about is what does research methodology look like? What does engaging with lived experiences look like during a pandemic when people's approach to field work is very different? And I think actually, Michael, you raise a really valid point about, well, actually we need to reflect on what that might look like if 6, 9, 12 months down the line when we're still in this space, and what therefore does exactly those processes you're talking about, what might they look like? I know Par's right, we're not there yet, but we need a deeper set of conversations about what that might look like that is of use, not of value, not of economic value, but of use.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we've got to bring into that is that apart from Umberto, no Cubans have spoken in this discussion about it today. So I think really thinking about including the Cuban participants in setting those parameters is really important, and how we work on this fact that we're having a lot of conversations with each other and making sure that they're getting an equal voice in that.
Absolutely, really, really important point. We haven't figured out how to do it because they're just learning to adapt their technologies to COVID and everything else as well, but there must be a way of doing it. But back to the British train system, aren't we, and the fact that it's not at all articulated. None of these platforms seem to work with each other, but we will find a way. So that's a really important point as well, that it's not just about us talking to each other and talking to our communities, but also making sure that we are communicating and dialoguing really equally with our Cuban counterparts. Michael, do you want to come back?
Yes, I do. I see that nobody is jumping in and saying, for example, it has to be a website. And the extension of that, which might especially apply to the toolkit. And that is, and this is to take account of the difference in the use of digital communication in here and in Cuba, it has to be an app that runs on a mobile phone, because that is what is being taken up more and more widely in Cuba now. Now, if that is a route that you wish to go down, and which would incidentally, if it took off, answer the impact agenda, but if that is the route that you want to go down, then you have to start now investigating how to do that, because it's not an add-on and it's quite expensive and it needs a proper designer, and it probably, right, you get my drift?
Absolutely get your drift.
There ought to be a way of doing it, but it's more ambitious than you're thinking of. And everything points to the increasing take-up of this kind of means. One model that drops into my mind, which I don't know if it's now in the form of an app. I encountered it originally in the form of a website, which was produced by anti-debt activists in Spain, was to produce a tool that ran on the web that allowed people in their local communities to analyze the budgets of the municipalities and discover forms of corruption which are especially prominent in certain countries like that. The point is that it was taken up and used in countries around the world.
Thank you. We may come back to you, Michael, because it sounds like you've thought about this more than we're currently thinking about it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we know just from the shape of the research bits that we need to put in that impact is absolutely key. What they understand by impact is key. And as Lauren, the point that she made, that as they understand impact may not necessarily be how we understand the difference that we can make, but we need to find a way to marry those two and across two cultures as well. So it's going to be quite ambitious. Lauren's got a hand up. Thank you, Michael, for your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that the dissemination will need to take many different forms, because not all methods will suit all people, either in within countries, let alone between countries. So I think that we have to think more broadly than just one or two ways of disseminating.
Fantastic. I think we're starting to lose people. So unless there's any burning questions or anything else that anybody on the team wants to say, we may have deserved our beer, rum. I think I'm going to have a cocktail of all of them. And never screen share again in my whole life, ever.
It's a shame we can't all do it together, isn't it?
It is a real shame, but it's been better than nothing, actually.
Oh, it's been fantastic. It's been fantastic. Yeah. It's just at moments like this, it's when you want to relax and you want to relax together. It's moments like this you notice it most, I think.
That's right. Just like the government, they're forcing us to be productive and not socialize. It's just.
But I forgot at the beginning to say congratulations to Tony and Par for this outstanding forum. Beyond my imagination. It really was excellent. The quality of participant and the really amazing.
That's really lovely, thank you. And I need to say actually very clearly, Isabel Story, can you make yourself visible, please?
And can you come and fix all our computers?
You have saved me so many nervous breakdowns. You don't even know. I did ask you to marry me yesterday. I mean it.
Yeah. Oh, we've got to get on planning. So you're very welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Izzy, for helping me.
No problem.
And actually, thank you to everybody for participating and so understandingly as well, because let's face it, there are all sorts of frustrations, but for example, even the boring business of keeping to time, actually, you all behaved with disciplina, which is what we really like, is disciplina. Well done.
So hopefully see you all soon in person. I'm not sure what else I can say. I'm just getting a bit emotional now. So it's lovely to see all your faces. We miss you. That drink, we'll probably just have a blast. Leicester people, next year, traditionally, the conference is in Havana. So hey, if we pull our fingers out and get this project going, how about it?
You look beautiful with your hair dress. It's lovely.
Tony's also a hairdresser on the side, Miriam. Thank you so much.
I've got to do something when I retire.
It looked terrible when you cut it. It's grown. Everybody take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Thank you for all of your comments and all of your papers and everything. Thank you.